Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this episode of Threat Talk. I'm your host, Bob Hansman, and we've talked before about the value of using a third-party resource to help with various aspects of cybersecurity. Nobody can do it all, and I even shared some surveys from the SANS Institute and others where their survey respondents came back and said overwhelmingly that there are very many aspects of the SOC today that they actually outsource. They can't do it all. And some of it's not things that you do every day. But we've talked from this perspective of channel partners and consultants, typically local resources who you might work with and establish a relationship. But today we're going to expand that discussion into the realm of the service provider. Now, we're going to have a couple of episodes on this to dig into certain specific areas of the service provider world. But today, to help us kick this off, we've asked David Ayers, who's the Senior Product Marketing Manager of Global Telecom for Infoblox, to join us and help us get going on this. Thanks for joining us, David.
Hey, thank you very much for having me, Bob.
Now, since this is kind of an introductory overview, let's start with a bit of an overview on what service providers do. I mean, we will be drilling into security towards the end, but just back off of that and just overall, what is the role of the service provider today?
I think, honestly, you can say that telecommunications service providers, they play just a massive role in basically everything that we do, right? They play a crucial role in communications, information exchange, entertainment. They make e-government work. They make just everything work, right? It's the backbone of the modern digital world. And when I was thinking about this earlier, I was just thinking about imagine if telecommunications had not evolved to where it is today. When we all went through COVID-19, a lot of us wouldn't have been able to have worked. A lot of companies wouldn't have been able to have conducted transactions. So imagine, if we didn't have that performance and that speed and that connectivity that we have right now. So yeah, I think they're central to everything.
Well, and the one aspect that, of course, I recall was with the internet when that came out. They had started out offering things like dial-up services and so forth to the consumers. But I was a remote worker way back then, and I remember getting ISDN. That was like ultra fast technology back in those days.
Oh yeah.
And instead of just having a phone line, which is what telecommunication providers originally were for me, from my perspective, they phone service. But then when they got into internet connectivity, they started doing that. But that was on the consumer level. But at the business level, they started doing things like WAN and stuff, right?
Absolutely. I mean, they've, I would say probably, and this is going back in time here, right? But if you go back into the to the 80s, 70s, and 80s, a lot of business was still conducted over the public switch telephone network, right? Copper, phone lines. It wasn't until around that time where you started seeing ISDN. You started seeing T1 lines that were going in. I remember businesses and the colleges I was at. I remember looking at the map of the internet and seeing 256K links, connecting our entire campus to the next backbone of the network. So yeah, it's everything has changed. Thank goodness, for the better. Things have gotten more faster, more reliable, but yeah.
Well, and back at those times when they were doing the WANs, I was in a different area of security and computer support, working for a vendor. I've almost always worked for a vendor after my engineering days. And one of the banks that I visited, I remember I joined them while they were having a meeting with their local service provider, and they were working with them on providing another line out the back of the building. One was in the front, one was in the back, because they were dealing with redundancy and uptime. If there was a construction that cut their line, which they'd actually experienced in the front of the building, road construction actually severed them from the internet. By the way, this was a bank, and so transactions that have to be conducted in milliseconds all of a sudden took over a day. They didn't want that to happen again. So they were having redundant lines put in. And I also remember them talking about compliance, that they actually had the service provider helping them meet a number of regulatory compliance challenges that they were dealing with. So, service providers started branching out. I think your timing, I agree, that's when I was seeing it around the 80s and 90s. service providers started doing more than, which is why we call them service providers, not just telecom anymore. They do a lot more than that. Now today, I'm going to go ahead and lead the witness here a bit, because I'm really excited, because you've been digging in for a couple of years into how this whole 5G thing is going, because they're on the front of actually new technologies now. They're not just supporting stuff like they did with WAN, but they're helping introduce new technologies that are changing the way we do business as well, right?
Absolutely. And I think that if you look at how things have evolved, and I don't want to go back too far in time, right? But you had 1G, which was when we were walking around with bag and brick phones, right? Completely analog. 2G started going digital. 3G. Now you have networks on this crossroads, right, of 4G and 5G, and then to make things even more fun, you're going from 5G non-standalone, which is basically where you still have a 4G core, but you have 5G radios, and then they're slowly over time going to move that to a complete 5G core, which is going to be a complete end-to-end cloud native, brand new generation. I mean, it's completely different than any of the prior generations. That is more cloud native, edge centric. When you start introducing these things like network slicing, where from the same radios I'm able to offer different services and speeds and metrics for manufacturing use cases versus consumer use cases versus business use cases, it's just a completely different ballgame.
Now, they also started, because again, the 80s, they started adding more kinds of communications. By the 90s, they started adding email services and things like that on top of your internet. Then they went into VoIP and IoT. I mean, it's amazing to me that in less than 2 decades, they went from a phone service utility to pretty much every form of connectivity.
Yeah. And they had to, and not just one service provider, but multiple service providers, because it's one thing if you're in, let's say, the Northeast, where you're in a large metropolitan area and you're going to have lots of competition, right? So you have this ability, to have, you may live in a locality where you can have cable, fiber, 5G, connectivity at your fingertips. In some areas, let's say businesses, and I'm thinking of sort of, let's say chain stores, right? Pet stores or something like that. They're going to use whatever connectivity they can find and possibly double up on 2 types of connectivity. So the example you gave in terms of point to point, I've seen a lot of retail outlets that weren't necessarily in a busy, metropolitan area that might be using cable to do their be able to hook into remote desktops to do certain things, but then they use T1 circuits, and this was 5 years ago, T1 circuits to do credit card transactions and send financial data back and forth. So yeah, completely different uses, and the providers really have to run the whole gamut of connectivity options for people.
And I think it's also important to call out, there are a lot of new entrants into this space. You can think of companies like Dish Networks and so forth, Hughes and other satellite dish kind of companies that have given a lot of people in remote locations internet access and so forth. And then, the latest one in that front would be like Starlink. They don't offer a lot of the old traditional stuff. They only offer some of the new stuff. So the area of service providers, the reason why we want to do this series on this is because it is becoming very complicated or complex. It's no longer one thing. And I have a feeling that we're going to have to come up with some new words here in the next decade or so to help differentiate the different kinds of service providers. Unless, I mean, are there any terms like that already starting to come out?
I mean, you're hitting the satellite, fiber, broadband. I mean, at the top level, you can say wireless and wireline. That's sort of, what physical medium are you using? But then when you get into the wireless, that hits a whole different area of different types of capabilities and spectrums. So yeah. Well,
let's kind of flip this now specifically into the security realm. That was a great overview, and I think it's important that even if a listener, if your focus is on just the security aspect, you need to realize all the other things they do. which is part of the challenge sometimes. The bigger the organization, the more kinds of services they do. That means that if you ever call them for service, there's going to be more options. Press 1 for this, 2 for this. Security might be number 9, So the more they offer, the more complex the organization. But it also means they might have more resources. That's a decision and a factor we're not going to get into today on how to choose one yet. But I know that on the security aspect, one of the big things that I first learned and was working with service providers on was preventing our internet from going down from things like DDoS. So, what are some of the security aspects that you see pretty much standard across the board these days?
I mean, it's funny. I was thinking back to I used to work at a service provider, long time ago. If I went back a little bit more than a decade of the types of services that they were offering on the security side, and some of them are still around, right? But I think the list has expanded a great deal. Back then they were doing things like intrusion detection, anti-spam, antivirus. They were doing managed firewalls along with their managed routers and managed VPNs and things like that. But I think since then, because things have become more cloud-centric, more edge-centric, everything we talk about here at Infoblox in terms of remote workforces, distributed offices, and things like that, I think that they've, a lot of them have really ratcheted up their security offerings in terms of threat intelligence, managed security event management. I mean, the list just goes on and on and on. And when you think about it, how are they able to do that? I sort of think to myself that if you take the largest of enterprise networks, you take a service provider network, that service provider network is 10 times the number of endpoints, the number of devices, the number of things that they have to protect. And so they're really in a good spot to be able to understand what horrible things can possibly happen out there, because they've seen it and they live it, and they have to protect their own networks in order to provide great service. They've gained that level of knowledge to be able to say, hey, let me offer these services to my enterprise customers, and even depending upon the provider down to even the consumer level.
And I remember, it's interesting that you highlight that they have to protect their own network, because if their network goes down, it doesn't affect just one organization, but lots. And I remember it was about 1.5 years ago that there was an attack on, in North America, a regional DNS service. And because that one service went down and everybody was dependent on it, it pretty much shut down almost 85% of all internet activity for half of the United States. And some of these service providers around the world, certain countries, they have a dominant, if not exclusive, service provider that everything has to go through. So keeping in mind that service providers do put, as the saying goes, all of your eggs into one basket, or maybe just a few baskets, does present a risk. But on the other hand, their size also gives them some scalability to make certain things more affordable. Certain services that if they're going to be offering it to everybody, it can become affordable. Some of those things might even be just part of what they use to compete in the market, to differentiate that, hey, with our service and connectivity, we also include these things. Whereas the competitor, they just give you the connectivity, and if you want those other things, you got to do them yourself. How
or hire a third party to do it for you. Yeah.
So how often do you see that kind of, or how much of a difference do you see between service providers? Because I mean, you're based in Europe right now. You used to work in North America, so you have a good global perspective. How much do you see service providers using security services as a differentiator?
I see that actually a great deal. I think you'll normally see it with some of your larger, top tier service providers, the ones who have, ironically, I think a lot of enterprise business, and they focus on certain verticals. So that gives them that sort of level of experience. So if you happen to be a very large provider that's doing a lot of state, local government, you probably have a very good handle on compliance. If you're, if you're handling, manufacturing, or if you're handling, just a multitude, retail, you probably have a good handle on that. You're going to be able to offer those types of services and tailor those. I think if you go down the stack, they might, lower tiered service providers might be partnering with other MSSPs or other MSPs in order to augment those services. But I've seen a lot from the larger globals down to the tier twos where they have a fairly decent, robust security practice, or even a managed networking practice for that matter.
Well, and we keep using the word service. We refer to them as service providers.
Yeah.
But what they call services is not what a lot of people tend to think of. But
Yeah.
they are offering real, what we would consider real services. Like you can hire them to come in and do some pen testing. And I'm seeing a lot of them starting to offer those kinds of services. It used to be exclusively those things that a consultant would be hired to do.
Yep, absolutely. And I remember even penetration testing being done 8 years ago. That was the type of thing that they were able to easily come in and sort of do that. Or even beyond penetration testing, threat assessment, risk assessments, things like that, to be able to tell customers, this is sort of what we're seeing here that you might need to take care of. I remember, the one provider I worked at, we had a very large cloud and colocation practice. And so as part of that, your customers might be running on your systems and networks that had to be PCI level 2 compliant, or they had to be HIPAA compliant. So you were a part of the compliance conversation, even if they were using their own auditor or we were able to help audit. It was just par for the course. It was something that just, it was reasonable to be asked for and reasonable to be delivered.
Yeah, in the late 90s, I was working for an AV vendor at the time, and they actually were working with a number of service providers that were looking at offering security as a service. And at the time, they wanted to use a home desktop antivirus as a bonus. Hey, you buy your connectivity from us, because this was a consumer-focused communication. So buy your connectivity from us, we'll give you licenses for antivirus, and we're $5 a month more or whatever it was, but we'll keep you maintained. Now at the time, that actually failed, because at that time you didn't subscribe to a antivirus or other security service. You bought product back in those days. That was pre-subscription. The only people doing subscription were service providers. So it failed because of the pricing model. But today we are seeing those kinds of things come back into play, because the technology and the desire by the providers was there, but the mindset of the market wasn't quite ready for it. And one of the things I'm seeing today in that is, and it was one of the triggers why I wanted to go talk about service providers. There's a lot of things to cover here, but I noticed that a lot of the providers I was able to choose from for both my personal service and when I set up, my wife actually owns a rather large business herself. And so when we were looking at business and consumer services, some of the providers said, oh yeah, and for DNS, we just point you to this free service. They just redirect me elsewhere. But others, it's actually part of their offering. They actually have a managed DNS capability. How big is that? Because I'm just talking about my little region here when I just recently moved to Texas, in the United States. How is that globally? Do you still see that kind of differentiation?
I think for the most part, the providers, of course, would prefer you utilize their DNS because they're able to control the experience. They're able to control, at a network level, how quickly you're going to be able to go to something, and they're able to cache that response. So if you think about a lot of the places that people go to, maybe it's either in the morning or afternoon. I'm just thinking of news websites. They pull up Apple News or whatever they have on their devices, and they're scrolling through there, along with 10,000 other of their friends are probably going to the same place in that same geographic region. So they're able to pre-cache that content, which is good because they're giving a really good fast response there. But I was, when you were talking about that before, I was thinking of how even today, there are some providers that are still bundling in software, with a service. And guess what? Consumers don't like installing software. They don't have the time for it. And so if you're able to, if you're utilizing your own DNS, you're also able, a whole bunch of them in North America, but I think even more so outside of the US, are able to offer value-added services either for free or as an add-on to say, hey, we can give you a little bit more protection on your network, so that if you're about to click on something that's malicious, we can actually stop you from doing that, or at least stop that request from going through. And in some areas, you have regulatory requirements that you are supposed to provide some fundamental level of protection, so that children, people aren't going to websites that you don't want them to as a parent. But that's a network-based control that the providers are in a beautiful spot to be able to provide that capability.
Now, we've talked a little bit about where service providers came from, where they are today.
Mm-hmm.
I want to kind of pick your brain on the future. You've alluded, and I want to clarify this for the audience, that you've been in it for a while. I've actually seen the pictures of you in those little concrete bunkers, playing with all the wiring closets and trying to figure out which circuit goes where.
Oh, yeah.
And cursing the guy who was there before you. So you've been in literally the trenches on this from day one. And so I think that gives you a good perspective on where they're going. What might we expect next from the service provider industry? What kind of things are they going to be driving?
I think that one of the first big things is that, and I know this is going to be a massive shock to everyone listening, but 5G, I hear, is going to be a big thing. I'm saying that as a joke, right? But no, I think 5G is going to be, for a lot of consumers and businesses, a great equalizer. Because remember when I said that if I'm out in a somewhat rural area, I may not have a lot of selection on my internet. And the fastest thing I might be able to get is a T1 that I'm using for internet and telephony. So 5G will be able to service a lot of different communities, a lot of different regions. There are a lot of places in the world that aren't even on 4G yet. People might be still using 2G, and they're using that for internet connectivity. So 5G is going to be a big thing in terms of the services, and they're going to look to expand their service footprint utilizing 5G because it's cheaper for them in the long run. I don't have to send trucks out. I don't have to send technicians out. I can have people even self-install from a consumer standpoint. But I think the next big thing is that providers are going to be collaborating a lot more with other players in the digital ecosystem. And what I mean by that is right now, a great number of providers have built out their own telco clouds, right? So they went from physical network functions, physical devices, to virtualized network functions, so virtualized things running on hardware. But I think the next phase of this, within 5G, is going to be the big, driver of that are containerized network functions, and that's going to allow them to really push things out to the far edge and satisfy a lot of those use cases. But at the same time, that's also going to increase the number of IPs, the number of devices, the number of things, and it actually creates, I think, more of a security risk because you have a larger security footprint in order to manage.
Let me ask a question on that, though. I mean,
sure.
Are we talking about them becoming like another Amazon Web Services, where now they've got marketplaces where I just select things and all of a sudden they spin up a container now from my account and I've got this new service? Is that the kind of thing we're looking at from service providers? Are you going to compete in that market?
I don't think they're necessarily going to compete. I think they're going to work with. So I think that you're going to see this convergence of telco clouds and providers working a lot more with the public cloud providers. And there might be a little bit of what you just described in the middle. The providers might have capacity that they can actually rent to other enterprises or other businesses to be able to put applications on the edge and be able to work with that subscriber base or that enterprise segment that they're trying to work with. But I do see that you're going to have this convergence of looking at these use cases and working more together. I think a lot of the providers tried to be their own clouds. They might have not have really gotten some success in that, but I think you're going to see them working in a much larger ecosystem.
Now, I want to go back to one thing you said just a few moments ago. Mm-hmm. I debated actually interrupting you at that point, but I'm glad we finished that. A lot of the things that they are offering, 5G is what you were talking about specifically at that moment.
Yeah.
And you were hitting on some points that I really want to highlight again for the audience. 5G, a lot of us tend to look at it, well, I want 5G because I want faster bandwidth. That's how it's marketed. Right. It gives me faster, bigger band, faster data speeds, etc. Which, by the way, my phone says 5G all the time. I don't think I've ever seen that kind of performance. But and that's probably my cell provider rather than anything else.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem is that that's the way we look at it, but it is a lot more. You mentioned that doing things like 5G will give them more serviceability options. I mean, there's a lot under the sheets of these technologies, and 5G is just a good example. But the things that these service providers are rolling out also give them benefits that then have indirect benefits to us, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So
on the 5G side, let's dig into that a little bit here. Why is 5G so important just from a global interconnectivity standpoint? I think this is real important. It's not just more bandwidth, but our entire infrastructure actually becomes stronger and more resilient with 5G, right?
Absolutely, because if you look at how it is the first cloud native mobile architecture, end-to-end cloud native. The functions inside of it are cloud native, and 4G wasn't like that. 4G, for the most part, was still utilizing hardware. This is all software based. So from a provider perspective, again, they can provision or change out new services through software. They don't need to send someone out 50 miles to a cell tower somewhere in the desert and swap out a line card. They can do this, remotely. It's going to save them money. It's going to make them more efficient. It's going to allow them to upgrade services faster, which in turn means that we, the consumers or the businesses, are going to be able to consume and utilize a lot of other services. And one thing to sort of not just make this all about 5G, all of these principles are bleeding into your wireline, into your advanced broadband. It could be cable, it could be fiber. All of these cloud native principles are all related. So when I use that word telco cloud, there are some providers that are doing mobile, Ethernet, fiber. They're running the whole gamut of services that they're able to offer, and they're using those cloud native principles in that entire system.
Well, and where I was going to lead up to this, and unfortunately we're getting close here, but I want to lead up to the fact that this kind of work is also foundational for a lot of those other things people are looking at, like, hey, when am I going to have all the cars are going to be connected, and IoT beyond just a thermostat. All of these new technologies that we're anticipating in the next 5 to 10 worlds to be everywhere, they require this. If we don't get 5G right, we don't have those technologies really they're not going to be able to do what they promise.
Absolutely. And I think going back into the security side of things, right? Once you have all that running, then you need to find ways to be able to secure them, to optimize them, to make them better to fit the profile of the users and the businesses that are utilizing these. Which, when we talk about the evolution of the services, to think 10, 12, 13 years ago when I was there on the service side, that there are now IoT services, there are health services, things that are riding on these newer technologies, and I'm talking about security services, monitoring services, ways that these providers can help businesses actually kick off these new services. It's just absolutely amazing, and it's going to be really interesting to see in the next 10 years as these networks evolve and these services are rolled out, of how that's going to play out.
Yeah, and I know we've focused a lot on the goodness. I'm counting on our listeners to also be realizing the whole time that every time you introduce some new technology that offers promises and benefits, there's a risk to go with it. Some of those are the things we'll talk about later, but unfortunately, we have really run out of time. But David, thank you for joining us.
Hey, thank you for having me on. It's been a pleasure.
And I want to thank all of our viewers and listeners for your time as well. Join us next time as we continue our efforts to help you stay on top of cybersecurity and ahead of cyber risks on Threat Talk.